Over the past few years, I have done a bunch of game jams. Game jams are quick projects that I make, usually with a short time limit and maybe another restriction or two. They were a great way to learn new things in game development, and in this video, I'm going to be going over 10 of the best ones that I participated in. On this channel, I do lots of game development videos, including many long-form ones like this, so be sure to check out my 2 years of game development video if you want more. Okay, time for the first jam. Kajam and Replit are holding a game jam. Anybody is open to join, and the grand prize is $10,000. In this game jam, we must create a game from scratch in 7 days, but the catch is that said game has to be submittable on Replit. Replit is an online coding IDE that allows you to collaborate similarly to Google Docs, and it supports a host of languages and libraries for making games. And although I could technically build a game using Unity and export it to HTML, I don't really want to do that. So, I'm going to, for the very first time ever, create a game with no engine, with $10,000 on the line. Sounds like a great idea. And this video is sponsored by Replit and Kajam. Although anybody is allowed to join this game jam, there are several other game dev YouTubers participating, such as the mustache-twirling Vimlark, creator of Monkeys with Guns, the Python master Tech with Tim, and Polymars. I don't think he's done anything interesting.
Hey!
Moving on, at the beginning of this week we'll be given a prompt for the game and development begins. Well, I guess we just wait until then. Have I told you about Couch Combat? Couch Combat is the game I've been developing in Unity for almost 2 years now and is available to wishlist on Steam. And don't tell anybody I told you this, but I'm going to release it completely for free, although I haven't announced that in any devlogs as of yet, as I just made that decision. The game is a split-screen multiplayer FPS with a low poly art style, tons of stages and weapons, and couches. Even our special guest Polymars likes it. Polymars, you need to say your line. Polymars?
Say your line or I'll never let you out of the basement again.
Oh, would you look at the time? I guess I'll move on. And so the jam began on Monday, and the theme that they announced was huge. I like this theme. It isn't incredible, but at least it isn't some form to link together for the 15,000th time. Besides, the real constraint for this game jam will be scoping my game to be simple enough to be able to create without the help of an engine. For those of you who don't know, not using an engine means I have to do a lot of things myself that are usually handled by Unity, like physics and rendering, and I also don't have access to tools like a stage editor or any sort of UI designer, and so I'm going to keep things simple for this game. My first thought was just to make a platformer, and I literally have not made a platformer in a jam since my second game jam ever, which is over 2 years ago, and you couldn't even jump in that game, so that wasn't even that much of a platformer. So I got a few things out of the way. 1. No camera movement. The game will be built with just one-screen stages to keep it simple to develop. Then I had to come up with a gimmick, preferably one that included the theme huge. So I thought about possibly allowing you to pick up and carry a heavy box to walk on that slows you down when carried and you can use it for puzzles. But that just sounds really boring. And then I had the idea of making you getting knocked back from a huge gun the main movement mechanic. And I instantly realized that this was the absolute best course of action, and the concept of a comedically large Glock in the title, Barack and the Glock, followed suit. And ironically, I decided to keep the controls simple and just have moving left and right and shooting, removing jumping. So currently out of my 2 game jam platformers that I've made, I actually do not have jumping in either of them, which is the main feature of platformers. And to round out the first night, I just whipped together a glorious sprite. Beautiful. Although I'm going to submit the game through Replit as that's required, I'm going to stick to the VS Code simply because using an offline IDE generally just runs better. It actually ended up taking several hours for me to figure out how to install Python and Pygame and use it in VS Code, but we don't talk about that. And then it was time to learn how this whole Pygame thing works. Luckily for me, not only is the API super simple and well documented, but I also found a great tutorial on how to make a platformer, so I followed it for a while. Basically the way that this game is going to be set up is that the levels are made in a 2-dimensional array, which is just a bunch of arrays within arrays, and each number in the array represents a type of block, 0 for air and 1 for blocks. When I start the game, I have a stage object that creates the stage by cycling through this array, and with that I have basic stage building without an engine. The player movement is pretty basic, with a gravity force and collision on the blocks, and the final thing I got to doing on Tuesday was shooting. In order to shoot, I have to make the bullets point at my mouse, which is something very basic in Unity with all of its built-in functions. But in order to do that in Pygame, I had to invoke the dark arts of trigonometry. Legends say that this is literally the only use of the unit circle outside of math class, but I simply use A-tan to get the angle that I need to point the bullet in, and then in order to move the bullet, I switch those degrees into radians, and then I use sine and cosine functions to make those degrees into x and y floats, which I can add to the bullet's position every frame. Yay, trigonometry. So the first thing I did after getting to work on Wednesday was just adding knockback. The direction of the knockback was pretty easy to calculate. I just need to take the negative of the direction the bullet is going in. But then I had to make a dampening system and get it feeling good, and after a lot of messing around with the values of gravity and movement, I got pretty decent knockback working, and it is pretty fun to use. And now it is pretty fun to move around in the game. Well, that's an issue. When you go at high speeds, the player might clip through the boxes on the outside and just go flying, and this is a pretty common issue in games in 2D and 3D, and the solution that is usually used after normally checking for collisions is simply to make a raycast in between where the player is and where they are going to be after the movement is applied to this frame. If it passes through any walls, then collide with those walls. This keeps you from just flying through them, but the issue is that Pygame does not have a raycast, so to get around this I had to come up with a slightly more complicated solution to the problem. If your player starts moving at a speed which is faster than the blocks that make up the game's width, then instead of just collision checking where the player is going to end up after applying movement this frame, I also loop through points in increments just smaller than the size of the boxes that make up the grid, and then I check collision there. And this prevents all clipping since everything in my game has the same collider size. Cleaning up collision took a massive amount of my time on Wednesday, but I managed to get bullet collision in as well as a counter for the bullets in the game, and I pretty much have all the fundamentals in the game now, so I'm going to get to work actually making the levels and systems that allow the core game loop to work. Building the groundwork for level creation was next, so I made a system for switching stages. It's very simple, it just clears the list of objects and then repopulates it with new ones based on the new stage. And I also added a door which moves you to the next level, as well as some targets that have to be destroyed before the door opens to bring you to the next level. Plus I added a counter for the bullets. And since I have the essentials in place, I'm going to make some levels. It kinda hit me that I need more objects, so I added a simple spike object that reloads the current level and also the ability to restart the level with the R key, and then it was back to level creation. The game currently feels kind of unsatisfying. I mean, it is a Glock that is significantly larger than the person holding it, so it should feel more powerful. So I added in some sound effects to the game. Most of the sound effects are made in BFXR, which is a free tool you can use to generate simple retro sounds. It's great for game jams, and for the gun sound I just used some of the ones that I'm using in Couch Combat. And for the first time ever, my game actually has original music as well. My friend who has a YouTube channel called Where made some music for the game. I generously slapped it into the game and then proceeded to turn it off for testing purposes. You can check him out in the description as he makes some other music, some of which has been featured in my videos before. The mainstay for making guns feel good in any game is screen shake, and it was surprisingly easy to do in Pygame, especially given the fact that I don't even have a camera system set up for this game. Instead of rendering the game directly to the window like I have been doing, I just rendered it to a surface the size of the window, which I can then apply screen shake to, and then I rendered that surface to the window. I finished off at beginning the creation of a tile set for the game. It'll be a pain to actually implement, but it'll make the game look so much better, so I'll do it. And unsurprisingly, switching the levels to a new tile set took forever. This is because the new tile set had about 30 tiles in it versus the old one's 5. Each tile is a number in the level editor, and since some of them have double digits and some don't, I had to account for that, and it took forever, but the game looks much nicer now and I updated all the levels. And I also added a speedrunning timer on Friday. It was pretty basic to make. It just works by taking the time at the beginning of the game and subtracting it by the time that you're at right now, and then it pauses that whenever you complete the game. And since now I have a speedrunning timer, I should probably make it so you can actually complete the game. I originally spent forever making the windscreen separate from the main game wall loop, but it ended up messing up the rendering and I didn't really want to mess with that, so I just made it a level in the game. And whenever you enter this level, you get the text that just informs you of your winning status, and the timer stops too, so you can tell just how slow you are at completing the game. Finishing up the game was basically just adding in lots of small things. I added some basic animations to the player and flipped its sprite to face in the correct directions. I built the 5th stage and I fixed up some of the code to make it more readable. And the final thing I did on Saturday was adding a destructible box to the game, and this might just be the most revolutionary update I've ever made to any game I've ever made. It's a box, and whenever you touch it, it explodes. It was actually fairly complicated to code, and uses similar code to the knockback stuff for the player, but more importantly, it has no real use in the game. Nevertheless, it quickly became my favorite part of the game, and I made sure to make the boxes explode if the bullet hits them as well. For the last day, I just had to finish up the levels, add a bit more polish, and export the game. The last 3 levels took a decent amount of time to build as I had to use a new tile set, which kinda sucks to work with, but it made the game look much better. And then I made the game maximizable, and I also made it center itself in the screen no matter what size the screen is. I also moved the UI up a bit and moved the game down a bit, which works a lot better. And then it was time to export. And it turns out that exporting a Pygame game is really hard. In Unity, it's as simple as pressing a button, but I had to do some weird things in the command line, and then it didn't even work. But then I remembered something. I'm submitting this to Replit, and because I'm putting it on Replit, I can simply move my code over to the online IDE and just ended up having to change a few things. I didn't have to export it or anything. And the main thing I ended up having to change was just halving the resolution, as Replit displays Pygame in a pretty small resolution, but halving the resolution was as easy as just cutting a few values in half, so it wasn't too big of a deal. And I'm really glad that I didn't have to actually export the game, plus it's cool that everybody can see the source code right next to the project in action on Replit. So be sure to check it out if you're interested in that kind of stuff, but be warned, the source code is messy. Oh, yeah, other people entered the jam too. Tech with Tim created a huge in just 10 hours, a platformer built in Pygame. Vimlock built a game where you clean a massive skyscraper, and I'm fairly certain that he did it in Construct 3 and exported it to HTML, and Polymars made like a frog game or something? I don't know.
Okay, that's too far. I've had a busy schedule lately of being locked in Levin's basement, so I had just 10 hours to make my game. Can you let me go now, bye?
In order to make the game, Polymars used Kaboom.js, which is a JavaScript programming library, and they are the ones who hosted the jam with Replit. I ended up using Pygame primarily because I already had experience with Python and stuff that I've been doing outside this channel, and learning JavaScript would have distracted even more from actually making the game. But if anybody was looking for an easy to use but flexible library for JavaScript to build games, then Kaboom is great. It even has the array-based level editor that I threw together built in, and it's a lot better than mine. So that's good to know, after messing around with my crappy one for so long. Thanks for watching, and thanks to Replit and Kaboom for sponsoring this video. And also thank you to Polymars for volunteering out of his own free will and for no other reason to feature in this video. It was a lot of fun participating in this jam. I've always liked playing roguelikes, and after dying in my 3-hour-long Risk of Rain 2 run because I accidentally touched a mushroom for 1 frame, I decided that it was time to make my own. Unfortunately for me, this is a YouTube video, so I only have 24 hours to make the game. And also I have to ask you to subscribe right now. Sorry, I don't make the rules. I think I have an interesting idea for the game to start with, but I'll let you in on that as I make the game. For now, let's just get started. So the first thing I did with this project was throw together some art. I'm keeping the pixel art, as it's fast to make and I like how it looks. However, I'm trying out a slightly different style this time, with flat, simple colors and thick, dark outlines. I think this style is clean and it's very easy to get looking good. So I made the player, who is just this yellow guy. Then I made a sword, an enemy who is a color swap of the player, and this. This is the engine, and you have to defend it from swarms of enemies. So this is probably a good time to explain my plan for the game. So my idea is that you're riding an elevator down, and you have to defend the engine to keep the elevator running. In order to do this, you can build defenses like these walls I just drew. The base gameplay for the game is inspired by an IO game I played years ago called Zombs.io. In fact, I wonder how that game is doing now. Well, it hasn't been updated in 6 years, and every server is filled with what I guess are bots. It just isn't the same. So I have some other plans, but I doubt I'll get to most of these in 24 hours, so my goal for now is just to make a basic game that is technically a roguelike in a day. And then I can maybe develop it in little sprints in future videos if I want to. But now that I have this art in the game, it's time to make the base of the gameplay. Okay, so it's been a few hours, but this is where I am right now. I used a lot of stuff from my main game project, Seaborn, in order to start this game. Personally, I don't consider it cheating, because I already made it, and I was already going to make very similar stuff in this game. So why waste time when I have a perfectly good base already made? These are the main champions which I am bringing over. First off, the instance controller. This is a base for all instances in the game, which are basically all things with health, like the player, buildings, and enemies. Having this base class will allow me to make functions like taking damage universal, which is way faster and cleaner. Second up, I brought over the player movement. It's a little bit simpler than it is in Project Seaborn, but there's basic top-down movement, these nice dust particles which have object pulling, and also some dashing. Finally, I brought on the attack system that I've been using in games for a little while now. This attack system is inspired by Archvale and is just a very simple system with swinging the sword and projectiles, but I like it. And with these champions in place, I have a basic setup for the player to move and attack. So it's time to build the very first unique part of this game, the building mechanic. I just made the building system. It was pretty simple actually. I set up grid snapping, instantiated buildings that derive from the instance controller, and they initially start out transparent and non-colliding, but whenever you place them down, it sets them up in the world, after checking to make sure it isn't colliding with anything. And now I'm going to build the scene with the elevator. It'll keep to the style of the game so far, but I want to try out having some 3D or fake 3D parts for the walls around the elevator to really make it look more like an elevator and less like just a ground. I'm not gonna lie, that was a huge waste of time. It looks bad, no matter what method I use, and now I'm almost out of time for the first day, and I made no progress over the last hour and a half. Oh yeah, I forgot to mention that I have to sleep. Yeah, so that's going to lose me a lot of time unfortunately, but I got back to work on actually improving the game, instead of just trying to add these little graphic enhancements. So I focused on making enemies for the next few hours, and I set up this basic enemy that just goes straight towards the engine. It's the slime. The slime deals contact damage to the player and anything that it touches. He's not a big danger on his own, but whenever he brings all of his friends, it can become an issue. And I also set up health bars for enemies, buildings, the engine, and the player. This is another place where the instance controller base class came in handy, as I only had to set up this logic once for instances instead of 4 times. Very handy. There are 16 hours left and I have a basic enemy, but the game ends after you kill the 3 you put in the scene, so I need to make a proper game loop. So I'm gonna do that. There are now 15 hours left and it's nearly 1 AM, so I am absolutely done for the night, or I guess morning, but I got a lot done in the last hour. I set it up so that the player respawns after a few seconds whenever you die. So dying as a player is not super punishing, but if you're dead then you can't rebuild walls, so it's dangerous and your engine could get destroyed, which actually makes you lose the game. I also made buildings cost money to place, plus I set up some UI for your building selection. Enemies give you money, which you can see over here on the other UI that I just made. Plus I set up the first new sort of building, the turret. It doesn't work, but you can build it anyways, and it works well as a very overpriced wall. And finally, I made enemy waves to spawn. I have to manually set up each of these waves in the inspector, which is not very roguelike of me, so I'm going to try to make them automatically generate soon. But for now, I can just use this to get a basic idea of how the game loop will work. But it's time to sleep now. So I slept, and then I made breakfast and stuff, and well, I have 5 hours left. Yeah, it's time to get going. I started out by just adding in some nice bits of polish, things that make the game more satisfying to play. So I added hit flash, some new particles for taking and dealing damage, some sound effects, and I polished the screen shake a bit so that it's less annoying. And now it's time to turn my focus to the turret, who currently cannot turn its focus to look at the enemies, so it's time to fix that. And I spent a whole hour on the turret. Originally, I really wanted it to turn over time to face the enemy. I don't know why I wanted this though, is that it took a lot of time and rotations suck and it just kept overshooting it, so I ultimately just cut it out and now it just automatically sets its rotation to faces the enemy. And getting shooting set up was easy. So now I have turrets to find the nearest enemy and shoot at them. And the best part is that I can reuse this shooting and aiming behavior for the enemies themselves. I sat down and drew out the last few pieces of art that I need. I drew out the 2 new buildings, the bomb tower and the heal tower. The bomb tower will basically just be the turret, but it'll shoot slower and deal crowd damage, and the heal tower will heal buildings around it over time. I also made plans for 2 new enemies, the giant and the centaur. And so I should probably talk about the name and theme of the game, as I actually have not mentioned it yet. The game is themed to hell. More specifically, the hell from Dante's Inferno, with the circles and references to Greek mythology and stuff. That's why there are centaurs. I didn't really include much of this theming in the actual game though, but if I ever continue development, then it'll be a lot more important. But for now, I'm going to implement these new enemies. I was going to add the old recolor of the player as a new enemy called the Lost Soul, which would pathfind directly towards the engine, which takes the gaps in your defense into account and goes around any holes. But I realized they would take too long to get pathfinding up and running, so I just made the other 2 enemies instead, who are more interesting anyways. The giant is super simple. It's a bigger slime with more HP that moves slower and deals a bit more damage. Basically, it's just a big tank. And finally, the centaur uses the same shooting script as its turrets in order to fire bullets at the player. I figured that an enemy that focuses on killing the player would be interesting. Another thing that I dropped was animations for enemies, as I drew out all these walk cycles for the centaur and giants, but I didn't want to spend valuable time implementing them, and I didn't think the enemies look awful without them, so I felt it was okay to leave it out. To get the game to actually be a roguelike now, so these 2 last systems I believe will make it much closer into a complete game. First off, chests. These will spawn after some stages and can be opened for money. And whenever you open them, they'll give you a random upgrade. The idea is that you'll have to adapt to these upgrades, and a similar effect to the items from Risk of Rain 2. You have some control over your build, but it's up to you to make the best out of the hand you are dealt from the random generation. And the other new system is the enemy wave generator, which will make the game infinitely scaling. Well, I implemented the chest system and a few upgrades. Admittedly, they are pretty basic upgrades. Each one only levels up all of a certain sort of building, which increases that category of building's HP and damage, if the building does damage. I don't know if this will really be all that fun, but it doesn't matter as I have to hurry up and finish the game now. And that's it. I got enemy wave generation in last second. It works with an animation curve, which lets me balance the amount of enemies that spawn. The way that waves generate is that each enemy has a cost, like the giants cost 10 points, the centaurs cost 3, and the slimes cost 1. And each wave has a point budget.
enemies are randomly spawned to meet this budget. It's a basic system, but it makes the game get harder over time with a large amount of randomization to each wave. Plus, I was also able to get the bomb tower in last second, but I didn't get to the heal tower. But that's it, it's time to sit down and play a few rounds of the game to see if it's actually any good. So I was testing the game, and it was kinda too easy, so I increased the enemy scaling and it got better. But there are still a lot of issues that I knew would happen, as 24 hours is just not enough time to properly set up all the systems I needed for this game to work well. The biggest issue is that you can increase the power of your base through these upgrades and building all these turrets and stuff, and the enemies increase in power over time. The player actually doesn't increase in power at all themselves, so you become completely obsolete as the game goes on. And also, just spamming towers everywhere is by far the best strategy at later waves, especially since you can place towers on top of each other, which needs to be fixed. Some other issues are that the chest and upgrades suck, plus enemies get stuck on them. That system honestly just needs to be completely overhauled and was kind of just thrown in there, that way I could say it was closer to a roguelike. But thinking about it, I believe I have a better idea for the system that's less inspired by Risk of Rain 2, and more so fits the tower defense style of the game. But that's something that I'll get to if I ever continue on with this game. Also, centaurs are annoying, and dying and respawning is janky. But I feel like the game has good elements to it as well, as the building and combat both feel pretty good. And I think that I could expand this into a pretty solid little game in the future.
In the past, whenever I'm doing game jams, I've often had quite lofty goals for my game, and most of the time I end up just barely scraping by and finishing the base game, and having basically no time to polish it. So I'm just gonna do a game jam, no gimmicks this time. I'm gonna focus on making a pretty polished game that feels good to play. And speaking of no gimmicks, I'm just gonna say it, right here at the beginning of the video. Give me subs. Okay, onto the video. The jam I decided to enter in was the My First Game Jam Winter 2021. Now, it technically isn't my actual first game jam, but they allow people of any skill level, so I think it's technically just a name. Also, the game jam is technically over the month, but I'm just going to do mine in 48 hours. The jam has a theme, but it's optional, and I'm not going to follow it, because I already have an idea. I'm going to make a game that's just one long boss fight. The game will be 2D, top-down, and probably pixel art, because I cannot draw. But that's all my plans I had before actually starting, so let's start. I began the jam at 1 PM on Sunday the 17th, so that means I have until Tuesday at 1 PM to be done. I started in the middle of the day because I was busy. But anyway, let's get started. I began by cooking up the sprite for the main character. I'm bad at designing characters, so I'm just going to rip the base design from Enter the Gungeon and make that. So, while my character looks about as original as the latest indie platform game, it serves its purpose well, and that purpose? Murder. But if he wants to get that murder done, then he needs a smooth and luxurious movement system. So I put together a basic movement system in Unity, which I then animated. After that, I decided to create his fine-tuned instrument of death, a sword. Now I could have something like the Legend of Zelda sword, where you actually have to hit the enemy with the sword. But that's dumb. And since my character is already a carbon copy of a top-down indie pixel art game with bullet hell and roguelike mechanics, I decided to Frankenstein on an idea I saw in another top-down pixel art indie game with bullet hell and roguelike mechanics. This time, I'm respectfully stealing the attack mechanic from the currently in development game called Archvale, which, if you haven't watched the devlogs for, you probably should, as they're pretty nice and you're missing out. But anyways, I made the sword orbit around the player, not unlike the player in my last game jam. Then I created a crappy little attack animation and made it emit a particle whenever you click. It's pretty janky right now, but I'll fix it in a bit because it's dash time. The time of the day where I add a dashing mechanic to my game. There, I did it. After this, I had a somewhat decent movement system, so I decided to move on to polish it up. I added some dust particles that are spawned in every few steps, and they might be my favorite part of the game so far.
And they still are.
Then I added in a bit of screen shake to attacking and redid its animation, and it's looking quite nice now. Wow, what is this? Nuclear throne? Yeah, I'm just hilarious. Anyways, I'm gonna move on to the boss fight. I put together a health system for the player and the boss, and made some incredibly ugly health bars for them. I fixed them later, but wow, these were terrifying. To finish off the day, I did some more pixel art. this time for the first and second stages of the boss. I did some planning during this time and decided that splitting the boss fight up into 2 stages was a good idea. The first stage will be this big turret thing that sits unmoving in the middle of the stage. And the second stage is a tank that moves towards you. The boss itself has 2 moving pieces, the turret and the base. The turret makes smaller attacks that are aimed at you and happen more often. The base has attacks that take up more space but generally aren't aimed at you. The turret keeps you on your feet, while the boss forces you to weave between its denser patterns and also fills up the screen with bullets, which is definitely necessary, not a waste of bullets. It is the second day and it is finally time to make the actual boss. Just kidding, I decided to make the room instead. The room's tile set is a pretty basic dungeon tile set that was pretty much just ripped from Heartbeast's tutorial thumbnail. Sorry Heartbeast, I would have watched your whole video, but I've got a boss to make. The first stage of the boss fight was just making a big state machine, using a switch statement. The stages of the boss fight are 1. Idle, where it idles, 2. Activate, where the camera moves to it and it turns to look at you, 3. Stage 1, where it's immobile and attacks you, 4. Transition, where it blows up a bit and becomes a tank, 5. Stage 2, where it is a tank, and 6. Dead, where it no longer is. I got to work making these stages. Idle is literally nothing. Okay, for activate I had to make the camera able to move between different locations and smooth. To do this, I used something called a lerp. This proceeded to not work until I realized that I had one line in the code messed up. Then it works just fine. Now it was time for stage 1. I decided to make an attack randomizer. So I made that and got to work on the first attack for the boss. This first attack simply sends bullet out in a circle around the turret. I had to make the player take damage and add some bullet objects and get them to actually move in a direction that wasn't just right, but that didn't take too long. Yeah. Riding off the massive wave of success of that first attack, I made a sequel. I call it the Double Burst. It takes what made the original special and turns it up to 2. It even adds a twist to the second part. Now that's what I call a sequel. I also finally gave the turret a role in a spin-off film called Bullet. And now I have attacks. I also have a somewhat playable boss fight, but it can be sort of hard to predict whenever the boss is about to attack. So I added a simple indicator by adding these guns to the sides of the turret that pull back whenever it's about to attack. I also added a shotgun attack to the turret that just shoots 3 bullets with slightly different angles. At this time, the boss fight was feeling very static. Now this wasn't completely surprising. After all, the first stage boss is permanently bedridden. But I decided to add one more unique part to this first stage to make it not just be the second stage, but with no movement. I decided to make a shield that comes up every once in a while and blocks all damage while up. In order to disable the shield, you have to search around for a little shield generator that can spawn at any of 8 points around the boss and destroy it. I also added a brief invincibility period after being hurt, and made everything flash white when damaged. So now the first stage is basically finished, so let's do the second. Before starting the second stage, I had to make a transition stage between them, so I just set the boss sprites to its flashing state, added a large helping of screen shake, and added some absolutely disgusting placeholder particles. I made the boss turn to the tank sprite at the end of transition, and made the boss turn to face the player like the turret. Then I made the tank constantly move forward, and there it was. Movement. Now, you'd expect the tank to be about as heavy as the real-world steel human container, but it's actually surprisingly easy to push, so I fixed that. The tank needed a bit more personality, so I decided to add some new attacks, and it covered up its lack of personality by wearing Hot Topic t-shirts and dyeing his hair. The first attack I added was a little tracking missile that steers towards the player and explodes into 4 bullets after a while. Then I decided to add another body attack and made a machine gun attack that is emitted from 2 little guns on the front of the tank. After a bit more bouncing, the second stage was feeling pretty good. The last thing I did before going to sleep was just adding screen shake to whenever you get hurt, blow up the boss, or dash. I woke up at 8:30 and got straight to work. I needed it done by 1 PM, so I needed to work faster than a redditor looking for your post history in order to win an argument about what shade of blue Steve's pants are. I started off by adding a state after killing the boss where the camera goes back to the player and transitions to the currently non-existent windscreen. I then replaced the terrible particles for the boss transition stage with these nice explosion particles. I also made a wall that appears after you walk into the boss room that traps you in there with the boss. Next up was more polished stuff, like a menu and a windscreen. They were both incredibly basic, but I gave the background a tiny amount of movement and it looks okay now. I also made the bullets get destroyed on collision with the wall. Then I started on player death. I first just made the player turn invisible on death. I then put together 2 pieces of the dead player, which are spawned on death. I also made it sprout endless streams of blood for fun. I made you able to restart by hitting R at any time, and also added some text on screen after death to inform you that you can restart. I also fixed the bug where you can move while dead, which was an interesting one. Next up, I added a line renderer between the shield generator and the boss. It doesn't look amazing, but it helps communicate the fact that the shield generator is making the shield, and also makes it easier to locate the shield generator off screen. Finally, I added a bit of fade in and fade out to the room transitions. I was getting down to the last hour at this point, so I decided to just add music and sound and be done. I added some music from Evan King of Danny fame, and made some sound effects using SFXR. But then, something tragic happened. I encountered a bug. This bug was incredibly annoying to try to fix, but also would basically ruin the game if it was triggered. This bug altered values like how long to animate the sword attack, how long and fast to make the dash, and how often the boss attacks, and it made them basically random. This could be disastrous, because it would completely ruin the player experience with the game. Sure, the boss fight could be great, but if the boss attacks super slow, or your attacks don't work properly, then it wouldn't be very much fun to play. I tried to fix this bug for a very long time. I would switch up the values in the script over and over again, but when I fixed one value, the others would seemingly be messed up, and then I'd run it again and they'd all be completely different. And to make matters worse, the values were different between the full screen mode and the smaller mode in the editor, and the issue still existed in the builds of the game, and to make things even worse, I had less than an hour left. I eventually decided to ask around in Discord, and then I got an answer that made me feel really stupid. Duh. I was subtracting from these cooldown values every frame in update, but update varies based on the frame rate of the game. The game was sometimes running at different frame rates in the editor because the editor is weird and the full screen must have a different frame rate as well. I just ended up moving all these cooldown values into fixed update instead of update because that updates at a standard time throughout the entire game no matter what frame rate you're running at. Then I just messed around with these values a bit and got them working. And finally, I completed the game with... Well, actually, I have something to admit. I didn't finish the game in 48 hours. It was more like 49 hours. So this game jam was officially failed. While the game jam failed, I think the game I ended up with in the end was pretty good. I submitted it a few hours later on Tuesday, and I guess I technically lied about making a game in 48 hours for the title of this video, but 49 hours sounds dumb, so screw you, it's staying at 48. Overall, I think this might be the best game jam I've done. In the past, my game jam games have always ended up half-baked, mostly in the polish department, but I think the focus on things like movement and screen shake ended up making this one a lot more fun to play in the end. I might be a fraud and a failed game jammer, but at least I'm not a Danny clone. Anyway, I should release a devlog of my game Carlson Combat next week, so be sure to subscribe for that. Bye.
In a game jam, you just make the game from scratch in a certain amount of time. And this time, that time is 72 hours. But I'm just going to do it in 48 hours because 72 is just a bit too long. I've done several game jams in the past, but this time I want the game to actually be, well, good. So my plan is just to make a simple game with a lot of polish and content, or, well, a lot of content for a game jam. The jam began on April 2nd at 12 AM, but I was asleep. So I just started at around 11 in the morning. The jam had both a theme and a restriction. The theme was courage, and the restriction was that the game had to not be set on Earth. Now for the whole not set on Earth thing, I could have just made the game kind of abstract, but I decided to set it in space, that way the theme would mean a bit more. In brainstorming ideas, I decided to just pick out the first one that sounded good. With the Attack on Titan fan game I made a fancy movement system, which was fun, but I didn't really get to make any levels or anything for it. So I decided to make a game with a fancy movement system and lots of levels. After a bit of thinking, I had my final, very basic plan. I was going to make a first-person parkour game like Cluster Truck or Jumps, with movement similar to Titanfall 2, so while running and double jumping. I also thought that it would be cool the theme of the game was similar to Rainbow Road on Mario Kart Wii, so a crystal ground above Earth. I also had some ideas for speedrunning and high score stuff, but I figured I would flesh that out later. So the obvious first step for me was making some movement. I started with the same basic rigid body movement system that I use for couch combat, but I removed sliding, because I felt like I just didn't really need it. After that, I followed a tutorial that added wall running to it. Overall, it was fairly simple, just adding forces to keep you against the wall and moving forward, disabling gravity, and rotating the camera a bit. But it turned out pretty cool. I also decided to make it so you could wall run on everything, not just certain walls. I think this was a good choice because wall running is by far the most fun out of the movement mechanics. After that, I was thinking about adding some more features like double jumping and maybe a dash like the one in Doom Eternal to finish up the movement. But then I realized that the guy who made the wall running tutorial already had a script that was like mine, but had all those features. So obviously I just took the parts of it that I liked and boom, finished movement. And really the movement is pretty similar to a game which literally everyone who watches my videos is familiar with. Carlson. And yeah, you're right. Well, I do think it's annoying that people just call just about anything a Carlson clone, as Carlson really is not the most original game in its own right. This is pretty much just its movement system. After completing the movement mechanics, I decided to move on to some level design. Now, I'm really not a master at level design, like, at all. But luckily for me, parkour is pretty easy to design. You basically just make some blocks with some jumps, add some walls, and you're done. The levels themselves are really not that hard to beat, but I think the fun in this game mostly just comes from doing them fast. And I mean, I probably spent like 50% of development time just playing them, so I think it's working. I made the first level, which is just a straight line of platforms and walls. Pretty basic, but you can already pull off some pretty cool moves on here, so that's a good sign. I realized at this point that times are going to be very important in this game, so I implemented a timer right away. I figured out how to track time whenever I was making my Attack on Titan game. I discounted time by adding time.delta time to a value every update, and then I converted that into a time span, which is just a thing you can use to write out time in a format like this. After that, I added some UI, which were just a reticle and a time display, as well as a start menu and a stop menu. These menus appear at the beginning of the level and whenever you finish the level. The start menu shows you your level number, your high score, and a goal time. This goal time was just my best time that I had whenever I released the game. My times are actually a lot better now, but I mean, I guess if you beat these goal times, you're better than Levin a few days ago. The end menu shows the time you got, your high score, and has a button to restart the level or move to the next. And I decided the way that I was going to track high scores was simply through player preferences. This is just a thing that Unity has that lets you store preferences like settings and stuff. The issue with these is that they can be pretty easily altered as they aren't encoded at all. But as this is just high scores for a game, I'm just going to let it slide. Player preferences are super easy to use, and I don't really feel like spending too much time on a high score system. So by doing that, I was able to quickly get high scores working. The one issue was it was only saving integers, which didn't let me save any decimal points. And I got around this by literally just multiplying the time value by 100 whenever I saved and dividing it by 100 whenever it loads, which allowed me to have 2 decimal points. I decided to do the graphics now before I make the rest of the levels. The first thing I needed was the actual skybox. I accidentally imported several 4K skyboxes at the beginning of the game jam, which took forever to load, but none of them fit at all, so I'm going to attempt to make my own now. I want to have a low poly earth in the skybox, but I have no idea how to actually add the earth to the skybox, so I think it's just going to be part of the world. I made the skybox by just following a shader graph tutorial on YouTube that was for making gradient skyboxes with stars. It worked really well, but there was sort of a distortion effect on the seams of the skybox for the stars. It's not too bad, but it's still kind of noticeable. Nevertheless, I moved on to actually making the planet. I just modeled it in Blender by using a spear and extruding and recoloring parts to make it look like continents. I like how it turned out. In order to make it feel more like a part of the skybox, I actually added a script to it to make it move relative to the player, which made sure that the player would never reach it even if he fell off. This added a sense of scale and also just made it so you couldn't fall through the world. And I made the planet rotate. I made the planet rotate slowly, and then it was done. I also decided to make the menu, because I usually save menus for last and they end up being garbage, so I might as well get it out of the way first thing this time. I just used the planet for the background, then I made a play button, a help button, and an exit button. But menus are stupid. You know what isn't stupid? Grappling hooks. I understand that just entering their name instantly makes my game even more of a Danny clone, but I want them, so I'm going to use them. I followed Danny's tutorial and made it so you can only grapple certain points, so I essentially now have grappling points. I made everything glow, and it looks kinda nice now. By this point, it was getting late, so I finished off day 1. I got back to work by making the grapple point glow red whenever you were too far away to grapple, and then glow blue whenever you get close enough. Then I got to work on the second level, which uses grapple points. I realized that if I made all the levels before making actual models for them, that I would have to come back and replace everything. So I decided to make these models. The platforms are basically just the same as the ones in Couch Combat. I still wanted to try to make them look like crystals though. The only issue is I had no idea how to do this. I tried to follow a shader graph tutorial to make ice, but it looks really bad. I eventually decided to just make the platforms gray and shiny, but I stuck little crystals on it that glow, and they look pretty nice, so I guess I did get my crystals in the end. I did end up spending a very large amount of time making a fancy crystal effect that was never actually used, so that was definitely a large waste of time. For the wall running walls, I just used a free texture I got online. I only use this because I didn't want to make all sorts of models for the different Pro Builder walls. Finally, I made a little flag that I stuck at the end of each level, that way you actually have an idea of where to go. After that, it was time to make levels. The third level I made ended up being so hard that I moved to the last level in the final game. In between making levels, I added a tutorial screen and a level select screen to the menu. The tutorial screen was really nothing special, but I'm pretty proud of how I did the level selection. Each button displays your best time and takes you to the corresponding level when clicked, and they only take 4 lines of code. I finished up the day by making lots of sound effects using SFXR. SFXR is just a sound generator that makes a random retro sounds for jam games. It is super helpful. I also got some music. It's copyright free and it's made by Home, who also makes that We're Finally Landing song that Summoning Salt uses. I also made a short animation for the title screen that uses the word courage, which automatically makes my game fit the theme. And that was the end of day 2. I really only used a few hours on day 3. The game was really just made in like 50 hours, but I'm gonna say 48 because that sounds better. The only thing left to do on Sunday was make levels, so I did that, and other than that, I just added a counter to the main menu that shows your combined times. Finally, I exported the game for Windows, Mac, and web. Overall, I'm pretty happy with how the game turned out. While I think the one I made last time, One Big Boss Fight, is a bit more fancy of a game, I enjoy playing this one a bit more, and it's a bit more polished. So I think it's a better one. You can play the games and decide yourself if you go to itch.io, link in the description. Yes, that was an incredibly smooth transition. The Game Maker's Toolkit Jam is the largest annual game jam in existence. Last year, a total of 5.2 thousand people submitted projects that were made over the 48-hour time period. And this year, the turnout was even larger, with nearly 6,000 submissions. A game jam is an exciting event for game developers around the world to compete and create games, and one of this size is practically unmissable. So, of course, I forgot what day it was on. So yeah, for some reason, I thought that the game jam started on Saturday and didn't bother checking on Friday. And so here I am, with only about 24 hours to complete a game based on the theme Joined Together. The first thought that popped into my mind were just 2 prisoners joined together by a chain, and you control these prisoners separately. But that was about the least creative idea possible, so I kept thinking. Other ideas that I briefly touched on were 2 linked timelines, but I have literally no idea how that would work. Then I thought about maybe a game where you switch between 2 characters in different areas whose tasks are somehow linked together, but honestly that just didn't really make me think of anything. The idea that I finally settled on was, of course, the first one I came up with. I decided that 2 characters linked by a chain wasn't a terrible idea. And I also like the idea of just having these 2 characters bicker comedically and have the gameplay just be a bit annoying in order to try to put you in the same headspace as the 2 characters. After all, being stuck to some other prisoner as you try to escape prison with a chain probably would be pretty annoying. I figured I could have the game do a bit of a spoof on puzzle RPGs where you do things like fight chairs that get stuck on your chains. But I realized pretty quickly that making a whole RPG system was a terrible idea, as I literally only had 48 hours. So I decided to instead just make a puzzle game with a chain, plus maybe add some basic combat, where you wrap yourself around the enemies in order to deal damage. I decided to start by making some character art for the game, and that's almost always a good start for me of 2D game jams because it just gives me a much better idea of how the game will turn out. I made some basic RPG style sprites. I made a forward, side, and backward sprite for each, but I only ended up using the forward sprite, which I didn't even give it animation. And yeah, this game ended up incredibly scuffed, even more than my other game jams, so keep that in mind as this progresses. The first character was named Matt, who is slightly smaller than the other, has bluest hair, a mildly annoyed expression, and will be the sort of straight man of the dynamic. The second one I named Rex. He's a big boy with brown hair, red outfit, and his character will pretty much boil down to being kinda dumb, but a lot less of a jerk than Matt. I brought all this glorious art into Unity and made some super basic movement. Then I looked around to figure out how to do this chain thing. I decided on using angle joints and rigid bodies. By just making a bunch of chains and connecting them with these joints, I made a pretty decent chain, which I proceeded to connect Matt and Rex together with. I messed with this chain quite a bit throughout the making of this game, but there were still issues where you could kind of overpower the strength of the chain, despite its joint strength being maxed out. I was able to make this issue less common by making the chain a bit heavier, but that ended up making movement get dragged by the chain more. It ultimately was not a huge deal, but it's something that I probably would have tried to fix if I had more time. But I didn't. The main goal I have for this game is to have a somewhat interesting and goofy dialogue, so I need to make a dialogue system for that. I've never actually made one before, but I have sort of an idea of how to do it, so I'm just going to go ahead and make it. I decided to make it so that dialogue is handled by a few arrays within arrays. The most basic class of it all contains the properties of a single statement from one character. Basically the text that he's saying, who's saying it, and what sound the text makes as it appears. And this is also where I could put things like talking speed and character portraits if I had them. Then this class is put into an array called dialogue conversation, which is all the statements that have an in a conversation. Finally, all these conversations are stored in a dialogue manager array that allows me to call individual conversations through the script. If this was a much larger game, then I would have probably stuck the conversations within the objects that you interact with to start them rather than the dialogue handler itself. But whatever. The only tricky part of this whole system was the fact that you can't really make arrays out of arrays. But I was able to get around this by making the array part of a wrapper class. It's a tiny bit janky, but it works. I also set up the UI for this dialogue system, and it totally works now, sort of. It turned out that a dialogue system would end up being the main focus for this entire project, but in the end I ended up with a really nice dialogue system that I could probably use for future projects or game jams. But because I didn't have a whole lot of time for this jam, it ended up eating up most of the time. But I added a skip function to the dialogue menu that lets you skip to the end of each statement, and I also added some sounds and redesigned the UI. At this point I was actually making pretty good time. It was only about 3 hours after I started, so it might have been possible for me to actually end up with a pretty good game. That is, if I had all the time until 1 PM the next day. But I didn't, because I was actually kinda busy and also kinda had to sleep. So I lost several hours of precious game jam time by actually doing things. And this is what I think ended up killing the game entirely, as I didn't have enough time to build out a lot of the stuff in the game. But I still had to keep moving forward if I wanted a sort of finished game by the end of it, so I did. I found a free tile set online for RPGs and switched up some of the colors to fit with the sprites already in the game. But I usually don't like using pre-made assets, especially for 2D games. I simply didn't have the time to waste on tile sets though, so I just had to use these. I eventually realized that I wasn't going to be able to get combat into the game at all, so now the game is just a goofy puzzle game with dialogue. I spent the end of the last day building the world of the game and writing dialogue. On Sunday I had even less time since the games were due in the middle of the day, so I continued to rush to get at least some sort of ending. I made the last few rooms and had an incredible ending that really just wraps up everything gloriously. Then I exported the game like 12 times. The web build was just not working for me, so I had to have it executable. The game is available to play, but I'll warn you, it's pretty grimy. This is probably the strangest game jam I've done, which seems to keep happening. But I still think that I ended up with a cool dialogue system, even if the game attached to it was eh. Overall, I still enjoyed participating in the GMTK Game Jam this year, but my final game was just not that great in the end. Oh well. Thanks for watching, be sure to like and subscribe, and bye. I participated in the Brackeys 2022 Game Jam, and it went pretty well, I think. I needed a break from working on networking in my main game Couch Combat, so instead of actually taking a break, I decided to join in the Brackeys Game Jam, and I dedicated all my free time for 2 days to doing a game jam. Refreshing. So for this jam, the theme is It Is Not Real. So I thought really hard and long about it, and well, I decided to ignore the theme completely. Honestly, I'm tired of generic game jam themes, and besides, most of the time I already have a core idea for my jam game, so having to fit it around a theme is just annoying. I don't care about scoring well in the jam, so I'm just gonna completely ignore the theme and just make what I want to make. So, what is this game idea anyways? Well, it's more like a mechanic, but basically the game is a top-down shooter where you have a baseball bat. But the only way that you can deal damage with it is by hitting a ball that bounces around the scene. I don't want to make the game all about chasing the ball though. It's more about a timing thing, that way you can focus on the enemies. I don't know if this mechanic will work, so that's the reason why I'm making it in a game jam first. So let's get jamming. Whenever I was initially laying out plans, I had pretty ridiculous ideas. I wanted to do a 2.5D art design and maybe even make the game into a mini roguelike, but I quickly cut down my plans into a simple arcade game in 2D. I really want to try 2.5D in the future, but I'll definitely need more time to do it. I'm using Milanote to plan out the game, which is a great program for planning and designing games and other projects, and I'm using it in addition to Trello. And I went right into making the game, starting with top-down movement. I've done this several times for game jams and other projects, so I just reused a bit of code and focused on getting lots of polish. I added dust particles and also made some animations using the Unity animator for the movement system. Pixel art purists will probably hate me for this, but I use rotation and scale to make the animations bouncy and dynamic. Game feel matters, and I think that my game is way better thanks to these few improvements. My next task was to make the unique attack system for the game. But your next task is to wishlist my game Couch Combat on Steam. Incredible segue, I know, but Couch Combat is a sports game multiplayer FPS that I'm developing. It takes inspiration from games like Stick Fight the Game and will also have online multiplayer on release. You can play the demo for free right now, and wishlisting really helps support my channel. Wishlisting is the best free way that you can support my channel, and since I have no marketing budget, it's very appreciated as it means that Steam will recommend my game to more people. Okay, add over, where were we? Oh yeah, murder. The attack system was pretty simple to put together. It's basically just a bat that rotates around the player that plays the animation when clicked that activates a hitbox. I made sure to add a slash line alongside a screen shake and even some chromatic aberration to make the attack feel good. But you aren't actually going to directly hit the enemies with a baseball bat to deal damage. Instead, you had to hit the ball. So I started by just making a super simple ball for rigid body and set the bounciness of the physics material to 1. The only code necessary for this system was just setting the velocity of the ball whenever it's hit by the bat. Now, this system certainly works, but it's a little bit impossible to use. The ball just bounces randomly around, and that really doesn't work for my game. I want the focus of the game to be more on timing and aiming at enemies rather than chasing the ball, so I'm going to program a custom bouncing solution. Making the ball always bounce to the player is pretty simple for my game for one main reason. The room is always just going to be surrounding walls. The way it works is just by pointing the ball at the player whenever it hits the wall and applying force in that direction. If there were more walls, then they can get in the way. For this game jam, I decided to leave the room simple, that way I wouldn't have to deal with this problem. But if I had to fix a case like that, I think I would just bounce the ball regularly until it has line of sight with the player. Next, I just had to make a combo system. The idea for the combo system is if you hit the ball many times in a row, then it'll continually increase in speed and damage. As the speed increases, it'll be harder to hit, and continuing the combo will also be harder. But the damage increase is obviously a good thing. I set the system up fairly simply, just applying a flat increase to damage as combo increases. Combo works with a timer that is continually counting down, and is reset whenever you successfully hit the ball. But the baseball mechanic was feeling pretty flat, so it's polish time. I increase the screen shake whenever you hit the ball because you can never have enough screen shake, and I also added a line renderer that increases in opacity as it speeds up. And also I made the ball stretch in the direction that it is moving. This creates a cool effect similar to what you might see in 2D animation, and I really think it helps sell the speed of the ball. And enemies are the last part I need for this to actually be a playable game, so let's do that. The enemies are split up into a few scripts, a control one that manages the health and other scripts, the movement script, and the optional shooting script. The movement script for the basic enemy moves in bursts at the player, aiming the same way the bullet does. The enemy also waits until its velocity is near 0 before starting to jump at the player again. This actually led to the enemy getting stunned whenever it's attacked, which is pretty cool, so I kept it. Speaking of being attacked by the player, I also made the slime take damage and get knocked back by the ball. The slime has a simple hit effect of just flashing white, and a nice amount of screen shake is also triggered. I was planning on adding corpses to the enemies for whenever they die, but it didn't really work out and it was just more clutter on the screen. So I removed it and instead opted to make some nice particles whenever the enemy takes damage and whenever it dies. I finished up the first day by just putting together the basics of UI for the combo system. It's a big bar that reduces its X scale as the combo runs out, and there's also a number in the middle that shows what number of the combo you're on. The UI works, but it's not really satisfying, so I want to add some animations to it tomorrow to make it feel really good, but that'll have to wait. And on day 2, that's exactly where I started. I made the combo UI animate, and I also made the ball slow down after each bounce. This makes it so that actually keeping up combos is more important now, as the ball won't just keep bouncing at a high speed nearly indefinitely. I also threw together an enemy spawner that I don't plan on keeping. And so the final step for the game before I can get into content polish and art was player def and damage. It's handled very similarly to enemy damage, but nevertheless I stuck in some particles, screen shake, and even made an animated player corpse that appears whenever you die. And well, now it's actually really satisfying to die in the game. I don't know if that's a good thing. I built out the second enemy, who has a gun. It's pretty simple. I just slowed down the enemy and made it shoot a bullet whenever it moves. The bullet aims at the player just like the baseball, and I made sure to make it look very different from the baseball so that people don't get them confused. It was at this time that I began replacing all the art in the game. I made a simple grass tile set that I think looks really nice, but the slimes blend in way too much because of the color palette, so I decided to recolor them all to different colors. This has the added benefit of making the enemies easier to distinguish between. After this, I made several enemies. A ninja enemy, which is just a normal enemy with longer weights and a much larger jumps. The aforementioned shooting enemy, who got redesigned, and the missile slime, which looks a bit suggestive. The missile slime shoots striking missiles while sitting still, but the missiles go way too slow and I forgot to correct it, so it's kind of a useless enemy. I finished up the art by making a full tile set with walls and then changing the grass on them to blue to make it easy to tell where the walls are. The only other things I did to the game were making some sound effects. The bat used a copyright-free sound that I got that pitches up higher with each combo hit, but for the player hurt sounds and enemy damage sounds, I made them with BFXR, which is a tool that randomly generates retro SFX for games, which is very handy for jams. I polished it all up, exported it for HTML, and submitted the game after just about 48 hours of work. So, how did the game turn out? Well, it's easily one of my simplest game jams I've made recently, but I like it. The mechanic is pretty unique. The only other game that I can think of that does something similar to it is Lethal League. The game feels great to play because of all the particles, screen shake, and animation, and they were totally worth the extra time to implement. Making the game was also quite fun. I've been slowly working through networking for my main project, Couch Combat, so just getting to make something quickly was refreshing. And I also love working in 2D, as it's much more straightforward and easy to add polish and make art for. I regret that I didn't have a better spawning system, as I was planning on making a wave-based system to make the game a little bit better, but instead it's just a randoms, which really doesn't help the game. But I just ran out of time, so whatever, it's fine. But in retrospective, since this game was mostly just me prototyping for a mechanic, do I think the mechanic is fun? Well, sort of. I didn't quite get it to the exact sort of mechanic I wanted this time, but I think I can change things up if I ever want to add this to a future game. I want the mechanic to basically be the same as a normal gun, but with a sort of active reload or attack timing mechanic. So I think the positioning should be completely removed from the equation, allowing you to focus on dodging bullets instead. The ball will automatically seek you out, and a bar above the flare will indicate whenever it's in range. You'll get a much bigger attack and speed boost if you hit exactly when you should, but if you miss by a bit, there will be a grace period that still performs the attack. It'll just be a bit weaker. This also means that it'll be possible to focus on aiming a bit more, which is definitely a good thing. And so I think that implementation of the mechanic in a similar way to this will be pretty fun for a future game. But anyways, that's all. Thank you all to my one and only Patreon, Howard House. A little over 4 years ago, on June 11, 2018, I submitted my very first game jam ever. It was for the Shenana Jam 2018, where the themes were based on the goofy titles of Butterscotch Shenanigans podcast, and I had chosen the theme Void Burger. My game was rudimentary to say the least. I remember being frustrated with how little I was able to get done in the time. And I also remember just how much time it took me to get basic stuff like movement done. But in the game, you play as a sentient cheese grater, and you have to stop any cheese from reaching the bland burger in the middle and ruining its perfect lack of taste. It was an endless arcade game, and you could dash and also shoot a ball that knocked cheese back from the burger. But cheese could basically just spawn on the burger and instantly make you lose, which was pretty frustrating to say the least. So now, after 4 years of learning game development, I'm going to try to remake this game using all of the things I've learned. I'm going to keep all the basics of the game the same. It'll still be an endless game about stopping hordes of cheese, but I'll make some changes and improvements to see how it turns out. I started out by making a Unity project and a cheese shredder, but the cheese shredder looked stupid, so I messed with its proportions and moved its face. Then I had to make a third-person character controller. I just made a custom script with a built-in Unity character controller and used Cinemachine, and it works well. I then added a simple dash to the character controller to make it a bit more interesting to control. Then it was time to animate it. I decided to try to make all the animations as bouncy and satisfying as possible, so there was lots of squashing and stretching, plus he does an epic combat roll for the dash. After I got everything hooked up in the code, I was pretty happy with how it all turned out. I really don't think it's possible to make a sentient cheese grater that feels better to handle. Next, I had added in the most important mechanic into the game, grating. But I guess I need something to grate first, so I modeled some cheese. Grating was pretty simple. I just made the cheese disappear when you touch it, but that obviously wasn't enough to fulfill my sick virtual cheese grating desires. So I added some particles to spray out the back of the cheese grater, and then I also made the cheese scale down a bit before deleting itself, which gives a nice cartoony grating look. And to finish it all off, I added some screen shake, which Cinemachine makes really easy to do. By the way, I totally recommend using Cinemachine. It was pretty hard to figure out at first, but once I watched a few videos and got the hang of it, I realized just how powerful of a tool it really is. Now that I have cheese in the game, I think it's time to violate a few more laws of science and imbue this lifeless chunk of dried up milk with a horror of sentience. In the original game, cheese has legs, which is fine, but I have a much better idea. I'm going to take advantage of the whole third dimension that I've added to the game, and I'm going to make the cheese physics-based. I'll just move it by adding a force facing the burger, a bit of upwards force, and a bit of torque to make it spin. So yeah, now the cheese can move, as it inches towards its one purpose for existing, and as a player, you can grade it out of existence inches away from reaching that goal. Good. Oh, and for some reason, if I spawn in an excessive amount of the cheese, then they'll eventually stop jumping towards the middle and instead commit suicide by jumping off the edge of the earth. I did not program in this behavior at all, but it 100% proves the rat utopia studies. Overpopulation will drive all of us insane. Now that I have all the pieces of the game ready, I just need to put them all together in a game loop. A game loop is basically the loop of things that you do during the game. Nailed it. So basically, I just need to make a lot more cheese and make it possible to lose. Cheese spawning is pretty simple. It just picks a random spot, checks if it's far away enough from the burger, and then spawns the cheese there. I also figured that the game would benefit from looking a bit less like a default Unity scene. So I made the world's most detailed texture in Photoshop for the ground, and I also set up a nice gradient skybox that fades to black near the horizon, adding in a bit of black fog and a bit of depth of field, and the game looks pretty nice with minimal work. The next stop for a game loop is a menu and a way to exit the game. It really doesn't matter if it's a 2-second long jam game. Just add a UI button that calls application.quit. Just make sure that whoever plays your game doesn't have to go into the taskbar to quit the game, because that kind of ruins the whole experience. But anyway, the menu for my game is super simple. It just has some text, a couple of buttons, including an exit button, some very detailed lore, some controls, and a burger. So now the game is somewhat complete. I just need to add a bit more depth and progression to it. First off, I just added a simple mechanic that should increase the skill ceiling. Normally the dash has a short cooldown, but I made this cooldown instantly reset whenever you shred cheese, so that allows for some smarter routing and strategy whenever it comes to movement. Next up, I'm going to be revisiting one of the mechanics from the original game that I've yet to implement. Basically, you can shoot these balls that knock back the cheese. I have no idea what these balls are, so I'm going to try and improve it a bit. Now they are tomatoes, and instead of knocking back the enemy a tiny amount, I made them freeze the enemy in place for a while, which makes a bit more sense in my opinion. I made projectiles millions of times, so it was a breeze to set up, and I added an OK particle effect and made the frozen cheese turn red. This adds quite a few choices to the game just from this simple mechanic. When I was playing the game, I found myself either aiming at groups and then dashing in and easily take them all out at once, or also just shooting the burger to freeze any cheese that gets close to the burger. Also, lore-wise, there is a tomato repellent shield on the burger that prevents the tomato from ruining its blandness, so don't worry. The only thing left to do was to make the endless spawning into a wave system that gradually increases in intensity. This is so that you get a better sense of progression and also some breaks from the cheese. I actually used animation curves in order to set up the progression. This allowed me to have pretty specific and also pretty flexible control over how fast it progresses, with the two variables that I modified being the amount of cheese that spawned in each round, which increases, and the delay in between cheese spawns, which decreases. Animation curves work great for this implementation, and I totally recommend using them as they make bouncing a breeze. But yeah, that's basically all. I made the game available to play on itch.io, so you can check out the link in my description to play it.
So Game Freak just reached out to me, and it turns out that they lost all the files for Pokemon Scarlet and Violet. Yeah, all of them. And they need me to remake the game for them, but they are running a bit low on funds, so they only gave me 24 hours of time to make the game. So here I am, in this totally real scenario. And I'm going to be remaking Pokemon Scarlet and Violet in Unity in just 24 hours, or Game Freak will totally kill me. So my goal is just to create a general recreation of Pokemon Scarlet's base gameplay with Pokemon battles, catching Pokemon, leveling up, and stuff like moving around the map and the legendary bike Pokemon. Now, the hardest part of doing this will probably be getting all the Pokemon models and animations, but I actually got a good idea of how to do that after watching a video by Avatar Nick. In the video, which will be linked in the description, Avatar Nick found a forum post that details how to rip all of the files for the 3D models and animations directly from Pokemon Sun and Moon. This is probably the best method, so I obtained my CIA file of Pokemon Sun, and then I went through the process of decrypting, extracting, and trying to import the files into Unity. I thought this process would be pretty simple, but it ended up taking hours. But a lot of this time was just waiting for it to load, so I decided to take advantage of the extra time, and I got the 3D model for the player and the third-person movement while I was waiting. I just took the model from a different Pokemon game, Pokemon X and Y, and after downloading him, I rigged him up using Mixamo's Auto Rigger online. And then I used Unity Starter Asset third-person movement setup to get him walking around. Going back to getting all the Pokemon files, I had numerous issues while trying to get them into the game, but then I finally got them to import, and only the first 20 or so Pokemon actually imported. I don't know if there's some issue with my game files or the way I extracted it or something, so I tried the process again from the start, but I started running into errors even earlier in the process of getting them. I spent even more time bug fixing and trying to figure out what was wrong, but I just couldn't seem to find the root of this issue, and ultimately I decided that I just had to spend enough time on setting up the project.
And even if I did get all those Pokemon models, I don't know how I would find the time to put all the stats on them. So I settled on just having around 20 Pokemon. Besides, if Game Freak is annoyed that I only have 20 Pokemon, I could just say it's a regional Pokédex or something. The third person movement is about all I'm going to do with the overworld for now, as I need to get the battle system working. I'm just going to keep these two sides of the games completely separate for now, and I'll work on transitioning between the two later. The Pokemon battle system is pretty simple. It's a basic loop of you picking what you want to do that turn, and then the battle stage where the two Pokemon attack each other, and then you go back to choosing what to do. So I built out all the UI for the battle system, and it's really ugly, but it's still functional, so it's good enough. Now, in order to make Pokemon battles, I need to have Pokemon. So I set up some scriptable objects to hold all of the stats for each individual Pokemon. They each have HP, attack, defense, special attack, special defense, and speed stats. I actually don't end up using the speed stats, but I still added them anyways. They also have about 4 moves that they can actually use. These moves are also scriptable objects, and they have a type, accuracy, and power. I got all of the values for all the Pokemon and moves directly from the Pokemon Wiki, so they should match the games. Dealing damage was next, and once again, I want to stick pretty closely to how the games actually work. So I'm going to go ahead and use some of the actual formulas for the game for dealing damage. This right here is the modern damage formula, and it's a bit much. But I can simplify it down to just this because my game doesn't have environmental effects, held items, or any of those other complications. The battle system is taking a while, but I'm getting close to finishing the base behavior of it. You might notice that currently the camera just stares at the ground during the battle state, and yeah. I'll get to actually adding visuals to the battles next, but let's finish the base behavior for the battles first. I already got all of the attacking done for the player, and thanks to how I set up the attack function, I easily repurposed it for the enemy. Now the enemy can also perform attacks, which are just randomly chosen from the 4 attacks that they know. This completes the main loop for battle. You can attack the enemy attacks back, and you repeat. Thrilling. I decided to switch back over to the overworld and program in the motorcycle legendary. There weren't any 3D models for me to just steal online, so I had to make one. And you can see my incredible modeling skills on display here. It looks pretty goofy, but then again, so does the actual legendary. I put it in the game, and basically all I did was switch the player model from the normal running one to just a model of the player sitting on the back of this legendary Pokemon. And then I changed some values of the player movement script to make it move faster. I turned off jumping and sprinting, and I made it move in the direction that the model is facing instead of the direction that the camera is facing. This subtle change makes it more like an actual bike to control instead of snapping to the angle that your camera is facing. And going back to the battle system again, I made it so that whenever your Pokemon drops to 0 HP, it faints and a menu opens up for switching Pokemon. You can also use this menu to switch Pokemon during a turn, and it works pretty much just like in the actual game. I needed to make it so you can actually exit battles, so I made it so that whenever the enemy Pokemon faints, the battle stage is disabled and the movement script is turned back on. Pretty easy. Next, I made some Pokemon instances that are hooked up to a little script that makes it so you can enter battle whenever you enter a trigger collider. Great, and now you can enter and exit battle. It's time to finally start using those models I spent 5 hours getting earlier. The wild Pokemon script just instantiates a model from the Pokemon scriptable object, and then I use code to crossfade the animation to an idle animation without needing a stupid animation controller. In the battle, I instantiated the player's Pokemon, and I also set up some animations for attacking and fainting. Overall, a really simple ordeal to get these working. They could probably use a little bit more polish, but I'm already running low on time, so I need to move on for now. Right now, all you can do is just spam attacks in battle and switch Pokemon, so I'm going to make these other buttons work. The run button is super simple. I just made it a flat rate that you can escape from battle 2/3 of the time, and that just ends the battle without giving you any XP. The bag was a little bit more complicated, as I first had to make a menu. There'll just be 2 bag items, a potion and a Pokeball, to keep it simple. The potion heals 50% of your HP, and I'm not gonna lie, I must need to brush up on my algebra because I had issues just trying to set up this super simple percent formula, but I finally got it to work after an embarrassing amount of time. The Pokeball is a bit more complicated, and here's the actual formula used to catch Pokemon, and then I had to make it add the Pokemon to your list if you have space, so I made it make a copy of the Pokemon instance and place it in the list. Not too hard. At this point, Game Freak was getting really antsy with me, as I was running low on time and I still didn't have a finished game. I told him not to worry, as they'd never actually launched a Pokemon game as a finished project anyway, so the only core system I have left to make is a Poke Center, which will heal all of your Pokemon and also replenish your Pokeballs and potions. After that, I just have to make a world in some systems for spawning Pokemon. The Poke Center is super simple, it's just a little collider you can stand in, and if you hit a button, then it heals you and gives you your items back. I later switched out the 3D model from the one in X and Y because it's ugly, to the one in Omega Ruby, which is just a bit more simple, and it is also a lot easier to repair the hole in the back of the model. By the way, a kind of neat behind the scenes thing for Pokemon is that in the 3DS games, most of the buildings in the game don't actually have a back to their models because, well, you never see their back due to the fixed camera angle. It makes sense and it's kind of neat. You might have noticed that I've had this bug for a little while, where the player's health bar just does not update. It's not an issue with the code, as I went back and checked through the code and it's exactly the same for the enemy and the player health bars, but the enemy's health bar works fine. And also the health bars themselves are clones that use the exact same scripts and events and everything. I have no idea what's going on, but I've wasted too much time on this, and now I'm down to just 3 hours left, so I need to get a move on, and I guess I'll just leave this as this ugly messed up health bar. I mean, that's just one very noticeable bug. It'll be fine. Up to now, my Pokemon have had all the same placeholder for attacks, and that sucks, so I'm fixing it now. And while I'm at it, I'm going to actually implement type advantages instead of the rock, paper, scissors that I've had up to now. Yes, their types have literally been rock, paper, and scissors. Come to think of it, I'm surprised there hasn't been a Pokemon that evolves through rock, paper, and scissors. It seems like a basic idea to me. Wait, no, that's off topic. I'm running out of time. I need to get back to work. I gave them all some of their right attacks. Obviously, not all of the attacks that they can have, as you don't gain attacks through leveling, and so I just picked some nice ones that all just deal basic damage because I don't have any other status effects or anything implemented. And then I made this nice, disgusting if-else thing that determines type advantages. It's ugly, but since there are only 2 possible paths for the code to go through, it should be pretty fine performance-wise. Not all code can be pretty. Only 2 hours left and I need to build an original, beautiful open world for the game. So let me look at pictures from the actual game for influence. There we go. Just like the actual game. And for spawning the Pokemon, I just set up a pretty simple script that just picks a random location on the terrain and evaluates the height of that location to spawn the Pokemon on the terrain. The Pokemon doesn't move. The lore is that this is in the mountains and they are all really cold, so they're just shivering and don't move. Also, whenever the wild Pokemon are spawned, I automatically get a level that is the average of the player's Pokemon party's levels with a bit of randomness thrown in. While this is obviously not like the actual game, this does have some progression, so I guess it sort of works. And after fixing some bugs with everything, I am basically out of time, so I packaged it all up and sent it to Game Freak. Oh, wait, I just realized that this is not an email from Game Freak, this is a blank sheet of paper. That's worrying. Oh yeah, you can't play the game, on account of it being filled with Pokemon 3D models, names, code, and also being a pretty crappy game in general. So yeah, go buy the actual Pokemon game if you really want it that much. It's probably a little bit better than this. Making it was an interesting experience as it's like a pretty complicated game with a lot of systems. Although it is totally scuffed and not particularly fun, it was just kinda interesting working on a fairly large scale project in such a short amount of time and having to cut all sorts of corners to get it done. I guess I ended up with the world's most basic Pokemon roguelike game. So I guess that's interesting. Thanks for watching, and bye.
Okay, so yeah, I'm gonna make an Attack on Titan fan game. I, just like just about everybody else, have been watching the latest season and I thought that the ODM gear would be a really fun movement mechanic. I figured that I haven't ever made a fan game before and it would probably be an interesting challenge to make it, so I set out to do it. I chose a short length of just 1 week because I can't spend too much time on it because I need to get back to my main project, and also doing it in 1 week sounds good for the thumbnail. Also, I found out that there were already some pretty impressive Attack on Titan fan games out there, and I sunk quite a few hours into an old build of Roke's old one because, like I guessed, ODM gear is really fun to control. Anyways, my game is not going to be nearly as polished or complete as Roke's. Instead, I'm just going to focus on mostly making the movement system and then make the rest of the game as afterthought. So I'd say this is less of a full game jam and more of a mechanic jam, which is actually kind of a cool idea. I might have to do mechanic jams for couch combat in the future. Anyways, like and subscribe if you want more. On to the development. I started off just brainstorming what exactly I need to replicate the movement. Keep in mind, this is before I had found Roke's game, so I really was coming up with this from scratch. Obviously, I need some sort of grapple hooks, one for the left arm and one for the right. This should work for slingshotting yourself and turning, and letting you hit a button to speed in the direction that you're facing with gas is probably a good idea. Also, being able to slide in the ground is a good thing to help you keep momentum. But the one thing I couldn't figure out how to do was shooting your grapples at once at 2 different targets to pull yourself forwards. But then I found Roke's game and my moveset was complete. There were 2 grapples, a gas boost, holding shifts to split grapples, and sliding across the ground. I was ready to get started. I started off by modeling. I kinda like modeling to start off a project, and I really only had to make the player for this project, so I made it. I just made the ODM gear using references. It's pretty simple and low poly, but it's good enough. Then I decided to just yank this free low poly human I found online and use it. I don't usually use free models, but I didn't feel like wasting time on unrelated stuff from the actual movement. Speaking of using free assets, I used Mixamo to auto-rig the player, and then I did a bit of looking around. I know that Unreal Engine has a built-in third-person template, and I was kinda jealous. But after a little while, I found a very high-quality asset called Invector that did a similar thing to that. It's a free third-person controller that handles animations, movement with rigid body camera control, and is very customizable and expandable. If for some reason I ever decide to make a third-person game for a game jam or something, I'll probably just use this because it's pretty great. But by the end of the day, I had third-person movement working with the model, just like that. The animations didn't really fit, the rig is off and the player is too slow, but it's pretty good progress. Free assets are overpowered. I started off just cleaning up the player a bit. I removed the swords because they kinda looked bad, but I cleaned the rig up a bit using Blender, and now the ODM gear doesn't bend with the legs. I then had to figure out how to make this somewhat slow movement system into a smooth and fast one for my game. In order to make it faster, I removed sprinting. Now, I know that sounds counterintuitive, but then I made walking much faster. And then the walking became the new sprinting. After that, I spent a long time trying to replace the running animations, and I realized there was actually an issue with the version of Unity I was using, and I had to go into the files for the animation controller asset and use Notepad to change some variables directly. But I replaced the running animation with a much more suitable one. After that, I made some grappling hooks. These were just made by following Danny's tutorial. I guess that automatically makes all of Attack on Titan that Carlson clone, so yeah, get screwed. I also made another grapple, and now it's beginning to come together. Sort of, okay, not really. But I made it so that you can hold space, then the grapples will pull you in faster. I called this gas at the time, but I later renamed it to pull because gas was made into a different mechanic. I went back to replacing animations, this time the falling animation. Now it sort of looks like the pose that they do in the show. After that, I decided that a good use of my time would be trying to get the player to face the way that they are grappling. This was a huge waste of time, and I completely scrapped it after a while. But then I just made some adjustments to the grapple and playtested, and both of these were very large time sinks for this project. I decided that perhaps you could go just a little bit too fast with the grapple, so I limited the speed to 60, which is pretty fast and takes a bit of time to get to, but is quite a bit slower than the speeds around 600 that I was hitting before. I decided that a bit more control would be useful, so I added in gas boosting. This just basically applies a force on the rigid body facing towards the mouse. It is really useful for starting off, redirecting yourself and fixing mistakes, but it has a fairly long wait to recharge, so you have to be careful whenever you use it. I also decided to add in a gas particle effect that is made whenever you do it. I made a mesh for it using a rock generator in Blender, then I simply emitted these rocks and made them slowly shrink. I like how they turned out. Although later I noticed a weird bug that makes it play for way too long. I actually never fixed it, so I guess it's a feature now. The movement was beginning to really come together at this point, although I still needed a key feature that I was a bit scared to make: splitting the grapple. I started off just polishing up the movement a bit more. Then it was split time. The system I designed for splitting was fairly simple. What it did was whenever you hold shift, a while loop repeatedly checks if there are any available graphic points by raycasting forward. And if there aren't, then he moves the raycast a little bit to the left or right of the screen and tries again. So I cranked out all the code for this in one go, and it miraculously worked on the first try for the left side. And after a bit of work, I got it working on the right side too. It definitely was unpolished though. Sometimes it just didn't detect things, and other times it would raycast out of sight and give you some really weird grapples. Though I fixed some of these issues, splitting is still definitely jank in the final build. But to be honest, it's not actually as necessary for movement as I originally thought whenever I was putting out the game, so it's not a huge deal, I don't think. I also tried to add animations to the grappling hook ropes, but that didn't work in the slightest, so I abandoned that idea. And on the 6th day, I was admittedly beginning to run out of energy. It mostly consisted of a loop of playtesting and slight adjustments, and I also made it so that you can slide on the ground if you're grappling and going at least a certain speed. This was a huge quality of life change and made the game much more fluid to play. And day 7 was the final day. I decided to buckle down and make at least a bit of a finished game with this project, so I tried to make UI for the splitting feature. But after almost an hour of work, I gave up on it because it really wasn't working and I was beginning to get tired of just wasting time on features that were difficult to make. Also, I was beginning to think that splitting itself was a completely broken mechanic and I didn't really want to mess with that. I moved on to making a basic menu that lets you go to 2 places: the sandbox, which is just a testing room, and a course. That's right, I made an actual level. This level has rings which you go through to complete it, and best of all, a timer. Yes, my game is speedrun ready. all one level of it. It was surprisingly kind of fun to try for best times at this level, and this was my best time at the time of the making of this video. And yeah, that's about all. So, as I kinda guessed, this turned out to not really be a completed game, but more of a complicated movement system, but I was able to pull some semblance of a game out of it, so that was pretty nice. As usual, you can download the game for free on itch.io. I really like how this project turned out, and I kinda want to keep going a little bit further with this game. Really making it into a complete fan game sounds cool as a smaller project that I could work on a bit. If I were to make it though, I would go in a bit of a different directions than the Rokes game went to stand out. Also, I have no idea if I'm pronouncing Rokes right, so... Though I like the racing through rings thing, I think it would be fun to make the game really physics-based and just make it sort of a Titan killing sandbox, where we could use more clever methods of Titans than just stabbing them. Maybe I could add just cause style grapple connector things and let you throw things at them, and the massive bragdolls would be great. But I don't want to get too ahead of myself because there is no guarantee that I will continue on with this project, so don't set your hopes too high if you actually care for some reason. Although I would like to hear if you want me to continue the project, so comment down below if you want to see this continued. Thanks for watching, be sure to like and subscribe, it helps out the channel and my ego. Bye.
I'm making an Attack on Titan fan game using the Unity game engine, and this is my progress so far. I actually started this game last year whenever I made the ODM gear in a week, but since the final season, well, the second final season is premiering now, I figured that it'd be cool to try to make that project a little bit more complete. So over the past week, I overhauled the visuals, movement system, and built an attack system in a Titan boss fight. And this is how. Day 1 wasn't actually a full day of work, but it was entirely dedicated to planning instead. I set up a board on Trello to keep track of the things I wanted to do, and then I tried dusting off the Unity project that I hadn't touched in a year. Surprisingly, the project still worked. If you haven't watched that old video, that's fine. You just need to know that it was basically just like ODM gear that you could move around. It was a pretty decent project, but it wasn't much of a game, more like just a fancy movement system, so I'm trying to build an actual game now. And surprisingly, after a year of non-use, the project still worked. I really don't know why I originally left the default skyboxes in the game as they look so bad, but I'll fix that soon. I have more important things to focus on first of all. But anyways, day 2 I started out by modeling the Titan. Modeling humanoid things is so much harder than environmental stuff, but I think that the Titan turned out pretty well. And yeah, I chose to model the Colossal Titan instead of a normal one. I know that doesn't make that much sense from a lore perspective, as the Colossal Titan is like a lot bigger than it is in game, plus it can make steam and stuff, but I chose to do the Colossal Titan instead for this week because it's just really iconic. Plus, there was a really good T-pose reference for it online. Okay, that reference is the main reason. Like seriously, 3D modeling is hard. But after I finished up the Titan, I put it into Mixamo. And I'm not gonna lie, Mixamo is seriously one of my favorite tools ever. Basically with Mixamo you can set it up and automatically rip humanoid characters without ever having to do it yourself. And if you don't know anything about 3D animation, just know that rigging is very boring and takes forever. So having a tool like this is incredibly nice. And Mixamo also has tons of free animations to use, which is also incredibly useful. After rigging the Titan, I put it into Unity and made it into a ragdoll. But I also made it so that I can disable that ragdoll and just use it for collision, so now you can climb on it. My plan for the Titan is to make it mostly IK driven. Inverse kinematics, or IK, is a really overly complicated game development and 3D animation term that basically just means that instead of manually rotating each bone to pose the arm or leg, you instead just have a target that the arm automatically reaches at. This can be used to make procedural animations within the game engine, and my plan is to make the Titan grab at the player with these procedural animations. I also want to make the legs IK, but that might not happen. But I got the basics for IK set up in Unity. I'm just using the built-in IK solution in Unity that I really wish I knew existed back whenever I was working on IK for couch combat, because I ended up building my entire own IK system for couch combat, and it's not very good and it took forever. But basically for this game, the Titan just stares at the player and also points his hand at the player, even when it's just a little bit out of his range of motion, but I'll fix that later. Day 3 was the day I had the most time to work on the game, so I really need to make the best of my time. I started by trying to fix a slight issue. Currently, the grappling hooks for the ODM gear are only designed to work with stuff that doesn't move, which really doesn't work with a Titan, so I need to fix that. Currently, the points which you are grappling onto are just positions, or vector 3s in the world, which means they can't be moved. So my solution was to make these into game objects that move around. This also allows me to make them child of objects, which means that they'll move with the object. So basically I just made these points check if the object that is being grappled to has a rigid body, which in my game, objects will not be moving if they don't have a rigid body. And if the object has a rigid body, then it makes itself a child of that object. And this makes it move with the object, which works really well and also allows you to pull smaller physics objects towards yourself, which could be really interesting if I add items of some sort to the game in the future. So after that little upgrade, I think it's time to give the Titan some actual behavior. So I decided to animate her, a movement script, and an eternal lust for human blood. For the movement script, I just made the Titan slowly turn to face the player and also constantly move forward. But now it's time to buckle down and do some IK. I hope this goes well. I first made the legs stay in place while the Titan moves by making them IK to a target on the ground, and then I updated these points to be underneath the Titan with a weight function. This made the Titan's feet snap to the new position instantly. But then I made the feet lerp and also tried to make them step by moving them to the height of the target on an animation curve. But the thing is, this really did not look very good, and despite how quickly I explained it, this took several hours. Eventually, I decided to cut my losses and just use animation instead of IK for the walking. So I took a walking animation off of Mixamo, slowed it down, and what do you know, it looks perfectly fine. So trying to do inverse kinematics for the legs was pretty much just a colossal waste of time. Yay. In order to make this animated walking look better, I added dust particles to spawn the Titan's feet and also added screen shape to the camera, and that looks pretty decent. Now that I have the Titan moving around, I need to make it possible to make it stop moving with a big shiny blade. Attacking will basically consist of holding control for a bit, which will launch you forward while activating a trigger collider on the player, and if you hit the collider on a Titan's nape, it will kill the Titan, which will just activate the ragdoll for now. And this wasn't too hard to code, and you can see it working here. It is currently pretty janky, as it's hard to see exactly where the nape is, and the movement needs a bit more polish too, so I decided to give you a bit more control by adding dashing in all 4 directions as well as up and down for the player. To make dashing, I made a script that listens for input, and then if it detects the double click of certain keys, then it will dash in the direction by setting the velocity of the rigid body to 0 and adding a force to the rigid body in the correct direction. And that works pretty well. The player attacks need animation, and this is kind of an issue for several reasons. One, I'm going to have to make these animations myself using Unity, so they might not look that great. But more importantly, I'm using a package called Invector for third-person movement. To be completely honest, it's not ideal. I put it in it a year ago, and if I was doing this project now, I would definitely not start with it. And if I had more time, I would probably replace it with a system I make from the ground up. But I only have a week, so I have to wait. So instead, I had to work around Invector. I spent hours trying to add an attack layer to the animation layers of the animator, but that just straight up would not work. I have no idea why, to be completely honest, but it really just would not work with Invector. So I set up a kind of gross workaround for now. I have another model for the player which I switched to when attacking, and I just animate that one instead. But I really needed to hurry up and move back to working on the Titan, so I settled with this. For the rest of day 5, I only had time to add a nice new skybox to the game and then make the Titan squat down when the player is low down enough. But tomorrow is my last real day of development, so I need to make some serious progress to call this anywhere near complete. I started day 6 by building a wall in Blender. I just made a single segment and gave it an array modifier along a circular curve, which looks pretty good. So then I imported it into Unity, and after a bit of time spent messing around with colliders and scaling, I had a pretty good looking stage. And then it was time to try and improve the Titan's behavior. I started off by removing the squat behavior because it really doesn't look good or work, and then I began to set up the Titan's eating behavior. It's honestly pretty simple. I just added a player model as a child of the Titan hand bone, and then I made a really crappy animation for the Titan eating, but it looks fine in the game, so whatever. Finally, I just disabled the player and their camera and enabled a camera that follows the player model that's being eaten. The rotation is pretty funky, but whatever, it's kind of funny. The player gets 8 whenever they hit a collider that's on the Titan's right hand, and I would have also done the left hand, but it doesn't really move, and that would have required a lot more animation, so whatever. And then to improve the Titan's behavior, I messed around with the IK of the Titan's hand and made an alert towards the player, which works somewhat well, and in order to keep the Titan from reaching behind its back, I use this weird dot product equation that returns a positive value whenever the player is in front of the Titan and a negative one when the player is behind. And apparently dot products are a Calculus 3 concept, so I really don't know how they work. But if it works, who really needs to understand their code anyways? I finished up by adding particles when the player kills the Titan or is eaten. Then I got to adding sound effects. Finding the right sound effects took a bit of time, but thanks to some cool people on YouTube who isolated things like the ODM gear sounds, I managed to get it all sounding pretty good using Audition. And here's the final product of this week of work. I'm pretty proud of how much I got done, but it still has obvious issues. The Titan's behavior is a bit strange, and if you're near the ground, it basically can't hurt you. Furthermore, the arm teleports around weirdly sometimes, which really shouldn't happen. So I at least want to fix things like that before I publish the game for free. And I do think it would be cool to finish this game and make it into like a wave-based arcade game where you can transform into the attack Titan for a bit of time whenever you get a kill streak and stuff, which sounds like a fun project.